My name is Sophie Marsh, and I was 19 years old the first time my mother chose her husband over me, and 22 the last time. And in between those two moments, she removed me from her life so gradually and so completely that by the end of it, the people in our town of Clover Falls, Tennessee, who had watched me grow up, were the only ones who still remembered that I had ever been part of the family at all. I want to tell you the full shape of what happened because partial stories produce partial understanding, and what happened to me deserves to be understood completely. My mother, Linda, married Gary Holt 2 years after my father passed. I was 17 when they met and 19 when they married, and I want to be honest that I did not dislike Gary immediately. He was charming in the practiced way of men who have learned that charm is more efficient than effort, and he was attentive to my mother in the specific way that someone is attentive when they are still in the performance stage of a relationship and have not yet revealed what the relationship looks like when the performance ends. I gave him the benefit I would give anyone my mother loved. I kept my observations to myself. I told myself that my mother deserved happiness, and that happiness sometimes arrived in forms that required adjustment. What I did not account for was how much adjustment would eventually be required of me specifically, and how little would ever be required of him. Please hit like and subscribe before we go further. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are. Now let me tell you about the 3 times my mother chose Gary over her own daughter, and what happened when she finally ran out of other people to call. The first removal happened 6 months after the wedding. Derry told my mother that having me in the house was creating tension. He did not say this to me directly, he said it to my mother in conversations I was not part of, and my mother processed it and arrived at a conclusion and presented that conclusion to me at the kitchen table one Sunday morning as if it were a practical arrangement rather than a choice. She said, "Gary feels like you two need more space from each other." She said, "You are 19 and it is a good time to be independent." She said, "I found you an apartment on Birch Street and I will help with the first month." She did not say, "I am choosing him." She did not need to. The first month on Birch Street was the only month she paid. I worked at the diner on Main Street and the pharmacy on weekends, and I covered my rent and I did not ask for anything, because asking had produced the apartment on Birch Street, and I was not interested in what the next ask might produce. Clover Falls is a town of 3,000 people. Everyone knew. The women at the diner knew, the pharmacist knew, my mother's friends from church knew. And some of them stopped by the diner to tell me I was welcome at their tables for Sunday dinner, which was the small town language of, "We see what is happening and we want you to know you are not invisible." I accepted those dinners. I kept working. I enrolled at the community college in the next town over because I had always planned to study accounting, and a plan is a plan, regardless of whether your mother is paying for it or not. Gary told my mother that paying for my college was a strain on their budget. The second removal arrived in my sophomore year in the form of a phone call in which my mother said she was not going to be able to continue contributing. I said, "Okay, Mom." I hung up. I applied for every available grant and took out the minimum necessary loan and picked up a third shift at the diner. I graduated 2 years later with my associate degree and a grade point average that the department head told me was the highest in my cohort. My mother sent a card. Gary did not sign it. The third removal was the one I did not find out about immediately. My father had left a modest estate when he passed, a life insurance policy and a small investment account that my mother had managed as executor, with the understanding, documented in his will, that the assets were to benefit both of us. I found out from my cousin, Darla, 2 years after the wedding, that my mother had updated her own will, and my name was no longer in it. Gary's 2 children from his first marriage were listed as secondary beneficiaries after my mother's share passed to Gary himself. I was not listed anywhere. Darla told me at the gas station on Route 9, quietly, in this specific, apologetic way of someone delivering information they know will hurt and feel they owe you anyway. I sat in my car for a long time after that conversation. I thought about my father and the life insurance policy he had paid into for 20 years to make sure his family was provided for. I thought about Gary's children, who had never met my father and had no connection to anything he had built. I thought about my mother signing those documents. I did not call her. I did not confront her. I drove home and I sat at my desk in the apartment on Birch Street that I had been paying for entirely by myself for 3 years, and I opened my laptop, and I started a document. I listed everything: the date I was asked to leave, the date the college contributions stopped, the date Darla told me about the will. I dated each item in the precise way I had been trained in my accounting coursework, because documentation is what separates a legitimate account from a complaint, and I intended for mine to be legitimate. Then I closed the document and I went back to work. Clover Falls watched. Clover Falls always watched, and Clover Falls remembered. Gary's business collapsed in the 5th year after the wedding. He had been running a landscaping and property maintenance company that had done reasonably well during the years when the local housing market was active, and had done significantly less well when the market softened, and 2 of his largest contracts went to a competitor from the next county who underbid him on price. By the time I heard about it from Darla, the business accounts were overdrawn, 2 employees had not been paid in 6 weeks, and Gary had taken out a second mortgage on the house my mother had owned outright, since my father's life insurance had paid off the first one. I heard all of this the way I heard most things about my mother's household, secondhand, through the specific information network of a small town where everyone knows everything, and most people eventually tells someone who eventually tells you. I had been living in Nashville for 2 years by then. I had taken my accounting degree, supplemented by additional certifications I had paid for myself, and I had built a client base doing bookkeeping and financial consulting for small businesses, the kind of work that travels well and requires only a laptop and the specific skill of seeing financial problems clearly before they become financial disasters. I was good at it. I was good at it in the specific way you are good at things you have had to be good at without anyone's help. My mother called me on a Thursday evening. Not Gary, my mother. She said, "Sophie, I need to talk to you about something." Her voice had the quality of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and is now discovering that the rehearsal was insufficient for the actual thing. She said, "Gary is in some trouble with the business." She said, "We do not know who else to ask." She said, "You know about finances." She said, "I was wondering if you could look at things." I held the phone and I looked at the wall of my Nashville apartment, and I thought about the kitchen table on Birch Street and the card my mother had sent to my graduation that Gary had not signed, and the document on my laptop with 3 dated items, and I said, "I will come." She sounded relieved. She should not have been relieved yet. I had not told her the terms. I drove to Clover Falls on a Saturday morning. I had not been back in 2 years, and the town looked exactly the same, the way small towns always look exactly the same. The diner on Main Street, and the pharmacy, and the Baptist church, and the particular quality of a place that has decided its shape and is not interested in revising it. I went to my mother's house, Gary's house now in practice if not entirely on paper, and I sat at the kitchen table where my mother had told me it was time to be independent, and I opened my laptop and I looked at Gary's financials. It took me 4 hours. At the end of 4 hours, I had a complete picture of the situation, which was serious but not unsalvageable with the right restructuring and the right decisions made quickly and consistently. I also had a complete picture of something else, which was the documentation of exactly how the household money had been managed over the past 6 years, including the investment account my father had left and what had happened to it. I looked at my mother across the table. Gary was sitting beside her with the collapsed expression of a man who has run out of options and is aware that the person across from him knows it. I said, "I can help you fix this." I said, "It will take 6 months of disciplined implementation, and you will need to do exactly what I tell you." Gary said, "Yes, whatever you need." I said, "There is a condition." I said it to my mother, not to Gary, because the condition was between her and me and had always been between her and me, regardless of how many times Gary's name had appeared in the middle of it. I said, "I want the will corrected. I said, I want what my father intended restored before I do a single hour of work. The kitchen was very quiet. Clover Falls outside the window was doing what it always did, going about its Saturday with the unhurried consistency of a town that has seen most things before. My mother looked at Gary. Gary looked at the table. Then my mother said, "Okay." She said it quietly. She said it the way you say something when you have been waiting for the moment to say it, and the word is smaller than everything it contains. I opened a new document on my laptop, and I said, "Then let us start from the beginning." By the time I left Clover Falls 3 days later, the will had been updated with an attorney present, the restructuring plan was in place, and every person at the diner on Main Street who had fed me Sunday dinners when my mother was choosing someone else knew exactly what had brought me back and exactly what I had required before I helped. Not because I told them, because Clover Falls always watched, and Clover Falls always remembered. That's my story. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. Drop your city in the comments, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.